A few years ago, I made a costly mistake. A mistake that cost me thousands of dollars. I picked the wrong flood insurance agent. This left me underinsured, and it left me overwhelmed when I realized how much money I had lost. In this video, I'm going to show you how to avoid the pitfalls that I fell into and how to pick the right flood insurance agent. So let's get started. Hi, I'm Chris, the flood insurance guru, and more than 10 years ago, I bought a house in a flood zone, just like this right here. I thought I was picking the right flood insurance agent, but I soon discovered that I wasn't. I soon discovered how much money I had lost. I had discovered I didn't have the right coverages and all these different things. So today, we're walking you through how to pick the best flood insurance agent for your flood insurance policy. Why choosing the right flood insurance agent matters. Look, picking the wrong flood insurance agent can leave you without the coverage you need when you need it most. It can leave you with paying thousands of dollars of premiums like I did, not knowing you didn't have to. It can even potentially leave you in the wrong flood zone, having a big impact on your property value. An experienced flood insurance agent is going to help you understand what your bank's requirements are. If you live in certain flood areas, they're going to be able to help you understand certain risks and things you need to protect yourself against. The cost of choosing the wrong flood insurance agent can cost you a lot more than money. It could cost you emotional stress. It could cause your family a burden that really shouldn't have to be there because maybe you didn't have the right coverages. Maybe you didn't know something was another option like I did a few years later. Maybe come claims time, you didn't know to ask the right questions to know how things were covered. Like the property owner we recently spoke to who lost $40,000 on a flood insurance claim because they simply forgot to disclose this piece of information. So these are all the things that matter when picking the right flood insurance agent, or that matter when picking the wrong agent. Not all insurance agents offer the same amount of coverage. So understanding insurance carriers is very important. Who offers what? So let's talk about specifically carrier access first, and how it can make a big difference on choosing the right flood insurance agent. So we're talking about carriers like Neptune Flood, Neptune Private Flood Insurance. We're talking about 5 things you need to know. We're talking about building coverage. We're talking about contents coverage. We're talking about additional living expenses, unattached structures, and even pool coverage. So let's start with building coverage here. Now, Neptune Private Flood Insurance can cover up to $4 million right now in 2023 on a building. Now, it's important to understand that you want to take a look at replacement costs. Just because you're going to put $4 million on a flood insurance policy doesn't mean you're going to get it. It needs to actually cost that to replace the building. Now remember, replacement cost is a little bit different than actual cash value. You can click up here in the corner of the video and see the difference we did a few years ago in replacement cost versus actual cash value. Now let's talk about contents coverage. Now, contents coverage with Neptune Private Flood Insurance will cover up to $500,000 on a residential property. I mean, that's big when you're only getting $100,000 through the National Flood Insurance Program. The other benefit with Neptune Private Flood Insurance is it provides replacement cost on contents. This means that if you had to replace, say, a TV in your house, you're going to get the money of what it would cost to replace it today, not what you paid for it 10 years ago. So that's really important. Now let's talk about additional living expenses. This coverage currently is not even offered by the National Flood Insurance Program. As we stand here in 2023, Neptune Flood Insurance will provide up to $20,000 of additional living expenses or temporary living expenses on a residential policy. And we'll tell you a story real quick. We had a property owner that had a private flood insurance policy when all of her neighbors had a national flood insurance policy right here actually on the lake. Property flooded back in 2018. She had 6 months of temporary living expenses to help pay for things when her neighbors didn't have anything because they had a National Flood Insurance Program policy. So this is the impact that things like temporary living expenses can have. Now let's talk about unattached structures. We're talking about detached garages like you could probably see here behind me. Things that are not physically attached to the building. Neptune Flood Insurance currently provides up to $100,000 in coverage for detached buildings. This could be big because with the National Flood Insurance Program, generally you're going to have to take out a separate policy for a lot of these things. That can get very expensive. Now, let's talk about basement coverage. Now, this is a big one. And when it comes to basement contents coverage, you see the National Flood Insurance Program doesn't even offer contents coverage in a basement. They're covering things that make a basement safe, like furnaces, circuit breakers, water heaters, things like that. So if you finish your basement, you have a National Flood Insurance Program policy, and you have a claim, you could be very disappointed. However, Neptune Private Flood Insurance will cover up to $10,000 and contents coverage in a basement if you have it listed on a policy. You want to make sure you have it listed correctly. That's why you want to work with an insurance agent that understands flood insurance as you're going through and you're selecting these coverages with Neptune private flood insurance or any private flood insurance company. You want to make sure that they can explain, what you may need in a certain situation. So we've talked a little bit about building coverages. We've talked about contents coverages. We've talked about additional living expenses. We've talked about unattached structures, and we have talked about basement coverages with the Neptune private flood insurance. So these are 5 things you need to know about Neptune private flood insurance. We're talking about Aon Edge. Aon Edge, which is a private flood insurance company. Today we're talking about coverages. We're talking about pricing, and we're talking about wait periods. Let's talk about coverages first. We want to break coverages into 3 areas. We're going to be talking about building, contents, and additional living expenses. Let's talk about building coverage first. Now, Aon Edge, compared to the National Flood Insurance Program, offers $1,250,000 on building coverage. That's great, and they can offer replacement cost here, while the National Flood Insurance Program may only be able to go up to $250,000. On contents coverage, they're generally going up to $875,000 and can potentially do it with replacement costs. This could be very beneficial. They can also offer additional living expenses, which is something the National Flood Insurance Program doesn't offer. So those things go into coverages. Now, let's talk about wait periods. With the National Flood Insurance Program, you generally have a 30-day wait period unless it's for a loan closing. Now, Aon Edge, it's also no wait period if you have a loan closing. However, without a loan closing, it's just going to be a 15-day wait period. Now let's talk about pricing. Now, the good thing with Aon Edge and the National Flood Insurance Program is neither one of these use flood zones to determine your rates anymore. They're using a lot of different factors like replacement cost of a property. Generally, the higher the replacement cost, the more it's going to cost in your flood insurance. They look at things like distance to water, the elevation of a property, flooding frequency, type of flooding in the area. These are all things that go into the factors for the rating with Aon Edge and the National Flood Insurance Program. So these are 3 things we wanted to show you today when it came to Aon Edge. Superior flood. Superior private flood insurance versus the federal flood insurance program, also known as the National Flood Insurance Program. Today we're going to be talking about things like coverages. We're going to be talking about pricing. We're going to be talking about renewals. And we're also going to be discussing claims. How are all these things handled with private flood insurance versus FEMA? What do you need to know when you're comparing these 2 options? So let's start with the National Flood Insurance Program first, because that's the easy one that everybody mostly knows about. On a building just like this one right here, it's important to understand that things like replacement costs, things like distance to water, you can't see, but just water sitting right in front of us, elevation of the property, these are all things that kind of contribute to pricing. So then what coverages does the National Flood Insurance Program offer on properties like this? We're talking about coverages up to $250,000 on the building, and we're talking about coverages up to $100,000 on personal contents or personal belongings coverage. There's no loss of use or additional living expenses available right now with the National Flood Insurance Program. What about renewal? With the National Flood Insurance Program, a policy is automatically going to renew as long as you've got everything in place, as long as your community is in what's called a participating community with the National Flood Insurance Program. There's a few exceptions where a policy could be non-renewed. Typically, it's a builder's risk policy or another exception, but it's extremely rare for something to be non-renewed with the National Flood Insurance Program. It typically has to do with documentation. Now let's talk about superior private flood insurance. So let's talk about coverages. Superior private flood insurance has been around since 2000. They're what's called a private flood insurance company. They offer what's called a non-admitted private flood insurance product. You can click up in the corner of this video to understand the difference between admitted and non-admitted. But we're talking about coverages on a building like this right here, of building coverage up to $600,000. That goes a lot further than building coverage of $250,000. As you can imagine, here in late 2023, $250,000 is not going very far to replace that property. On your personal contents coverage, they offer up to $50,000 in most situations. There is a rare exception where they can go up to $100,000. However, unlike the National Flood Insurance Program, they offer additional living expenses or loss of use up to $30,000. Now, this could help pay for a hotel for up to 6 months while your house is being repaired. This is a coverage that's not offered through the National Flood Insurance Program. Let's talk a little bit about pricing now. Now, with Superior Private Flood Insurance, they actually design their own pricing based on the contracts they have with their reinsurance companies. Their Pricing though takes into consideration replacement costs, distance to water, many other factors like claims history, your flood risk score. If you're in a 20-year area, more than likely, they're not going to be a good solution there. Now, all these different things determine their rates. Typically what we've discovered is that premiums are about 40% less than the National Flood Insurance Program in most situations as we're looking inland. Coastal could be some different exceptions because private companies typically have become very limited in coastal areas. So from a pricing standpoint, it could significantly save you money. Now let's talk about deductibles. Just like the National Flood Insurance Program where you have a deductible for each coverage, same thing with the Superior Private Flood Insurance. You got a building deductible, you have a contents deductible, you have additional living expense or loss of use deductible. So it's important when picking a deductible to understand you may end up paying 3 deductibles. Now let's talk a little bit about renewals. With the National Flood Insurance Program, they have these statutory rate increases of up to 18% on renewals. No matter what private flood insurance company you're working with, that 18% doesn't qualify with them. That's only with the National Flood Insurance Program. This means that particular private companies could skyrocket your renewals if you wanted to. However, what we've discovered is with Superior that almost 95% of their customers are renewing their policies because their renewal terms are very consistent. Do they have rate increases? Yes. Do they have rate decreases sometimes? Yes. But what we have found looking at companies in the private flood insurance industry, they are pretty consistent on slowly increasing those rates, not skyrocketing rates in certain areas. Does this mean that your policy may not get non-renewed or may get non-renewed? Yeah, it depends on their contracts. It depends if there's a certain area where their flood risk scoring system has changed. We see this with FEMA as well, where it may not necessarily be non-renewed, but your rates may skyrocket because the flood risk scoring changes. A lot of flooding has happened in an area, so we see this a lot. Now, what about claims? Now, like Superior and many private flood insurance claims, the claim process can actually be much quicker. That's actually what we've seen with Superior compared to the National Flood Insurance Program. You don't have as much red tape to go through. You're dealing directly with a private company instead of dealing with the federal government, getting everything approved. So it can be much quicker. So this is the difference between Superior Private Flood Insurance and the Federal Flood Insurance Program when it comes to things like coverages, when it comes to pricing, renewals, and claims. Now here at the Flood Insurance Guru, we offer Superior Private Flood Insurance as a solution to our clients. NFIP Direct, which is National Flood Insurance Program Direct, write your own carriers. Look, these are just a few carriers, but when we look at things like, for example, State Farm agents who have access to National Flood Insurance Program Direct, but don't have access to private flood insurance, or Allstate agents who have access to write your own carriers in some private companies, but not all. Then you can look at companies like Better Flood Insurance, Flood Simple, and Flood Price. Now, these are all national flood insurance brokerages that specialize in flood insurance. So it's important to understand that when you're choosing the right flood insurance agents. What do you look for when you're trying to choose the right flood insurance agent? Now, that's a question we hear every day. And one of the big things is flood expertise. Now, what exactly does this mean? Well, a lot of times this can mean understanding local flood risk across the country. You see, a lot of times larger companies don't understand those local flood risks. They don't understand the different threats because honestly, a lot of them just aren't worried about local areas. They're worried about more national. They may be worried about more Atlanta, Georgia than they are Macon, Georgia. Maybe more worried about Houston, Texas than they are Blue Ridge, Georgia. We see it every day. So working with an insurance agent that has flood expertise and local knowledge is very important. So when you're trying to choose the right agent, you want to ask, hey, what's your experience with flood insurance companies really pulling out in these areas? What do rates look like past this year potentially? What is my flood risks? They should be able to help you understand what your actual flood risk score is. Remember, this is the chances of your property actually flooding from 0 to 100. You can find your flood risk score by clicking in this video right here. But this gives you a good idea of maybe what premiums are going to do in the future. When also trying to pick the right flood insurance agent, you want to work with someone who's able to tell you when flood zones are changing, potentially when flood risk is changing, how it's going to impact your long-term premiums and certain bank requirements. These are all things that you should be asking when you're trying to figure out that flood insurance agent. Now later in this video, we're going to go through a list of 5 questions you should be asking that flood insurance agent before you make your selection. Now let's talk about what should you be asking this insurance agent that you're looking at picking. I'm glad you asked. So let's talk about 5 questions that you should be asking. The first thing is, what is your flood risk? Remember, you can find your flood risk score by clicking the description of this video. Remember, your flood risk has little to do with your flood zone. Your flood risk is, hey, what are the actual chances of my property flooding over the next 30 years, 0 to 100? this should be a score that they're providing you. And the higher the score is, also many times it can help you understand, hey, what's going to happen with my flood insurance premiums in the future? Are they going to keep going up? Could they go down? Now remember, this flood risk score is not a stationary number. It's going to be changing over time. And this agent should be providing these different numbers to you either throughout the year or at least at renewal, letting you see how this number's gone up, it's gone down, and the impacts it can have. Remember, these are different than flood zones. Your insurance agent should also be telling you what flood zone you're in, whether you're in a low risk zone or high risk. If you're in an area where mortgage companies are going to require it or they're not going to require it. These maps are constantly changing. So this is something you should be asking your insurance agent. The next question you should be asking this insurance agent is, how much flood insurance coverage do you need? Where do you start here? Well, the first thing is looking at replacement cost versus actual cash value. Remember, replacement cost is the actual cost to replace a building like this or your home. An actual cash value may just be a stated amount you get. So if you decide to insure for $100,000, but $100,000 is all you're going to get, it's not going to pay to replace your house. But once you take out depreciation, you may not be getting that $100,000. We see it happen every day. So you should be comparing replacement costs, and you should be making sure that they offer replacement costs for you, whether it's on a national flood insurance program policy or a private, to make sure that you get the coverage that you need. The third question you should be asking is, how are the national flood insurance program and private flood insurance companies different? The fourth question you should be asking, what are the different wait periods on these insurance policies? Am I going to be able to have it for a closing? Am I going to have to wait 30 days for this thing to get set up? That's the fourth question. Now, the fifth question you should be asking might be one of the most important ones, and that is, what does the claims process look like on filing a claim? How long do I have to file a claim? What do I need to expect when filing a claim? Because look, at the end of the day, insurance is no good that if come claims time, you don't have what you need. So you want to make sure that you understand how long you have to file a claim. What documentation do you need? Do you need photos? Do you need videos? All these different things. So this has been our video on how to choose the best flood insurance agent. Remember, make sure to share, subscribe, and like the channel below. Thank you.